So I was asked specifically within the international domain to focus on philanthropic sources of funding, foundations, as well as individual philanthropy. And that's partly because SMI has just hired a new advancement director as well, who would be able to help you with these kinds of sources of funding, and in addition to UQ sources as well. UQ has a foundations officer as well who can facilitate, but often those people need prompting from units within the university, and so you need to be aware of those opportunities first before they can really help you out. So first of all, what I'll try to do is lay out the sort of the landscape of philanthropic funding, because often that in itself is, people are not fully aware of the range and scope of what is out there and what's Australia's position in the rest of the world with regard to that. So if you look at different metrics of philanthropic funding, one of the ways in which people measure it is this World Giving Index. And often we're saying Australia it does not have that much private philanthropy, and that's true. But if you think about it in terms of the World Giving Index, where they look at not just the amount of money given, but the amount of time given for various kinds of philanthropic activities, Australia has actually ranked #1 twice within the last 5 years. In 2011, this is the data for the World Giving Index, and the larger circle indicates the larger amount of the Giving Index score. In Australia and New Zealand both ranked #1 in 2011 and 12. They've gone down, unfortunately, in 2013, and US is back to #1. But this takes into account how much time people volunteer, how much time people put in kind into larger grant proposals. And that's also very important in terms of also with industry funding, ARC linkage type grants too, the in-kind support is very important. And for that, Australia actually figures really well. But this score also is very indicative of some other players you might not think of, like Sri Lanka ranks within the top 10 in the World Giving Index because of a culture of volunteerism. And you may want to think about also countries where you want to do joint partnerships. The countries which have a very high score on the World Giving Index are likely to be players where you would find good NGO partners, partners where you would be able to get a lot of in-kind support, because that becomes vitally important often when you're writing these proposals. Sierra Leone, very interesting, in Africa ranks very highly in terms of that culture of giving and philanthropy in that context. So, and what's surprising is, Central and Eastern European countries, perhaps because of, well, I would say it's not surprising, perhaps because of a legacy of communism and so on, they often don't rank very highly in that, even though there may be, quite a bit of net wealth accumulating. Now, in terms of the big picture of charitable giving overseas, which is what we're looking at, of course, the US is highly dominant, both in absolute terms and in relative terms, in terms of per capita giving. So if you're talking about actual money given, Australians are not that highly ranked, but the US and then Switzerland, Ireland is very highly ranked. Again, certain cultural aspects of that, people trace that to sort of legacy of the potato famine and other things which have led to that. But it's quite interesting that in these kinds of graphs, you often do not find necessarily the players you might think would be there as well, in terms of the relative change, like the United Kingdom. One would think that it would be a little bit further up, but per capita giving there overseas is still relatively low. And this is not government funding. Again, I'm looking at foundations, individual philanthropy, and I can talk about government funding if you want later, but I was really asked to focus on the private philanthropy, individuals and foundations. Now, sources of funding for, again, the US, because it ranks #1, that's probably the place you want to look at first for the range of support. So the amount of money available in the US is astronomical compared to other places for private philanthropy. So in the US, nonprofits, a lot of those are universities, received about $300 billion in philanthropic support. If you look at the total world aid budget, it's about $120 billion. That means all the Australian aid, World Bank, UNDP, blah, blah, blah. All of that differed. If you combine all of that, that's about $120 billion a year. So within the US, you have almost 3 times that just given to charities within the US. So it's an enormous amount or range of funding that's available. A large part of that comes from individuals. And this is really important for us to be able to tap into individuals. And that's why UQ is making a special effort to tap into American alumni of the university. They've opened this office in Washington particularly for that, because of this very large number. And these can be transformative gifts. You know, if you get someone was willing to endow SMI or endow CSRM or any of our centers, you know, we'd be set for life. We wouldn't have to worry about all this, you know, fundraising, blah, 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 constantly. And that has happened with so many US universities. I mean, a $100 million gift in a US university is not uncommon. Usually every year, several universities are able to secure that. And that kind of an endowment, you can imagine, even if you think about a 5-6% return, it can provide enough money to, in perpetuity, run a center of our size easily. So this is really important to keep, think big. Don't think small about this opportunity as well. Corporations account for only 5% of the total philanthropic giving in the US. But it depends on the sector. So clearly in certain sectors like coal seam gas and others, this may well be very significant. But not necessarily. You still may have individuals who have had connections to particular industries who want to give funding in that regard. And that's been the case with many universities in Texas who have received individual philanthropic gifts from people connected to the mineral sector in the same way. Foundations account for about 14%, and this is the other bit which is very important, the bequests, which we should be paying more attention to here as well, and that's going to be part of the role of the advancement director, but it also requires networks individually, people, staff, students who might know, individuals who would be interested in a bequest as well. So that's becoming increasingly significant. Now, who gets the money overall within the US? Interesting, this is still very prevalent. Religious organizations get 1/3 of the money. Now, this is significant in the context of the work we do, especially because we end up often partnering many times with organizations like just out of the places where they work, like International Crisis Group, or there may be some of these other kinds of NGOs which have indirect connection to religious philanthropies, the Caritas networks, and so on. Especially working in Africa and developing country context. So education, about 13% out of the total philanthropy. The religion one, of course, can go into many of these other sources, but that's important to note that motivating factor for philanthropy in the US, 1/3 of it is coming out of a religious motivation. And often people think environmentalists get a lot of money, but they actually get a very small share. Especially in the US, only 3% or so of the total philanthropy goes to environmental groups. But what is interesting there is that many times, this is for the students and all, especially to keep in mind, a lot of the foundation support for social entrepreneurship around the environment comes from students. Some of the great NGOs in America were funded directly by students who applied for grants. One of the largest ones is NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. It started off with 2 Yale law students who applied for a grant to the Ford Foundation. They were funded for $1 million. Students. They wrote such a proposal that was very convincing to them. As soon as they graduated, they were able to set up the Natural Resources Defense Council. One of those students was James Gustav Speth. Some of you may know of him. He went on to then found also the World Resources Institute in Washington, and he became the head of UNDP, and then finally retired as the dean of the Yale School of Forestry. Started off just from a student entrepreneurship effort, applying for a grant to a foundation, and setting up an organization which still exists today. Okay, so there's a lot of opportunity, especially in the US, for this kind of social entrepreneurship funding. And increasingly, those foundations are willing to support work outside of America as well. Now, if you compare that to Australian philanthropy, it's a very small amount. It's only about 2.1 billion, less than 1% of the US overall philanthropy annually. And so, we have to keep in mind, if you're just going to look within Australia, you're going to have very, limited range of how much money might be available. So you really do need to look, especially at the US, but other sources too. And I'm going to share with you a list of other foundation assets in a moment. Within Australia, you've got, these are the largest foundations in Australia. So clearly the Macquarie Group, the banking group has a major asset base, and some of you are familiar with these foundations can be interested in the kind of work we do. They have in the past funded universities as well. So we should keep a lookout for these, and this is going to be, of course, part of the Advancement Office's portfolio, but again, one person can't do it on their own. You really need to have a whole culture of fundraising within the organization if it's to succeed properly. So you can't wait for the new person, Ilma Beaumont, to come and find, oh yeah, by the way, I think Macquarie Foundation might be the one to look at. Keep a lookout whenever you've got an interesting idea, a project in mind. These are some of the places which you could certainly be scoping out, and then the university can facilitate. Now, what are the kinds of foundations that we're talking about? There are family foundations, and the governance of these foundations is very important as to how you approach them. So Twiggy Forrest Foundation, which is the largest Australian private philanthropy now, but it's a family foundation, so it's not, that's why it doesn't show up in that list, because the money is still largely with Twiggy himself. He's given some bits and pieces here and there, but it's a lot of, it's sort of a situation where the family largely controls the wealth. So it's a family foundation. The Walk Free Foundation is focused on anti-slavery campaigns, and there may well be, he's made his money in mining, so eventually, there may be some interest in giving more funding for some connections to mining, and that's why I think he's a very important prospect for many universities. He's given already a considerable amount of money to UWA and to Curtin for scholarships. But the problem with these foundations is that they tend to be very personality driven. So you really have to court them in a way which is not always very professional in the context of, you don't have a regular proposal call and so on. So you have to be really building relationships individually with people who would be connected to the family, or oftentimes they will try to scope out themselves, individuals, and they always like to find you rather than you finding them. So it's a very tricky kind of situation there, but one which we should try to cultivate with the family foundation. The Waltons are the same way. The Walton family in the US, it's again one of the wealthiest families, but they don't have a professionally managed foundation in the same way. They do have various Walton family trusts, which do have a lot of philanthropy. But again, it's very particular, somewhat idiosyncratic as to how they would give the money. So like Alice Walton, one of the heirs, she's decided that she wants to completely redo a town in Arkansas as an art destination. So she's given about $150 million just to one little town in Arkansas to build a world-class museum there, because the family is from Arkansas. And so it becomes, it's much more, idiosyncratic, particular to what they want. The other one is the community foundations. These are foundations where individual philanthropists want to often give money anonymously, and they will give to a particular community and they pool resources in a trust. We recently got funding from such a foundation in San Diego. And it came about through a personal connection I had with the head of that foundation. But they have a group of families in the San Diego area who have a particular interest in Latin America. So they're especially interested in Mexico, Guatemala, and so on, because many of them have their summer homes there. And so they basically decided that there is a lot of mining development happening in Mexico, and they wanted to fund some research around mining. And so there was a sort of collective of funds which was gathered through the community foundation, and that helped to fund a project that we did. The same kind of community foundations exist for cities, villages all across in various parts, and this is certainly true also in Europe. The third category is the corporate foundations, and this may be slightly different from the kind of sources that Alf will talk about. Here I'm talking about philanthropic arms of companies which are firewalled from the main company. So there's a very clear distinction between the management and governance of the foundation of the company, like the Shell Foundation or the BHP Foundation, and they were set up to further the CSR goals of the company or other things like that. Often they tend to be very focused on community level projects. They often like to give money for infrastructure projects, for education and so on, but that can change. I mean, we have been funded through one of these foundations recently, the Tiffany & Company Foundation, and their solicitations for funding are available on a rolling basis. Anyone can approach them, and they will look into projects which fall within their mandate, and some of them have nothing to do with the main mandate of Tiffany & Company, which is jewelry, but they are interested in, for example, coral reef conservation. And one of the grants I got from them when I used to be in the US, it had nothing to do with the basic jewelry aspect of the Tiffany Foundation, but it was around coral conservation, how we could think about sustainable economies for island states around, which would allow for coral conservation. And we proposed that pearl farming, sustainable pearl farming, would be one of the ways to consider that. Even though pearls, it wasn't that, they didn't give us money because of the pearls, it was more because of the coral conservation, which was within their mandate. So it depends. It's very difficult to say what are the priorities of those foundations, and you really have to look through and figure out what they might be. Then you have these private-public foundations, partnership foundations. Yes, please.
Just a quick question. Why do you call them firewall?
Firewalled in the sense that the company will have no influence on the decision-making of the foundation itself. So the fact that BHP Foundation, if you are applying to BHP Foundation and you have a friend in BHP offices in Melbourne, they will absolutely be firewalled from influencing that. That's the general code of conduct, is that the philanthropy should be managed completely independently of the corporate decision making. It should not be a business decision in terms of the philanthropic gift that's given. So the public-private partnership foundations, this is a relatively new breed, and it was established, largely this has happened through the large gift of $100 million that the CNN founder Ted Turner gave to establish the United Nations Foundation. Ted Turner was very concerned that the US was distancing itself from its role in the United Nations. And so he personally said that I want to help the United Nations. Now, he couldn't really just give directly money to the UN, because the UN itself is funded through governments and member countries. But he created a separate philanthropy which works in partnership with the United Nations to help and support their particular projects and mandates. And actually, UN Foundation is another one which we could approach for funding, because they do a lot of work with universities. And the UN system has its own universities. There's the United Nations University in Tokyo, there's the University for Peace in Costa Rica. So an unusual one, but one which has much promise, and there are several others who, philanthropists who are thinking of similar models as well, with particular UN entities. And then you have, of course, the ones which we know much more about are the professionally managed philanthropic trusts. So these are trusts which were, originally the money came from some high net worth individuals. Like, for example, MacArthur Foundation, originally it came from a Chicago banking and investment tycoon. But now the MacArthur family has no control over it, because the way the foundation was set up was that it was meant to be an independent philanthropy which would go on in perpetuity and be managed on purely meritocratic basis. Okay, so it has a governance board, it decides things completely professionally as if it had nothing to do with the origin of the philanthropy. Ford Foundation, similarly, it was originally set up by Henry Ford's son. Henry Ford himself was not a particularly likable character and didn't give much initially, Henry Ford Sr., but his son set up the foundation, and it was set up basically by a gift of stocks in Ford Motor Company. A lot of the philanthropic foundations are set up that way. And then completely now it is professionally managed. There's really, no longer. Initially he was on the board of the foundation, but after about 20, 30 years, now the foundation is completely managed on a professional basis. So we have recently received a grant from the Ford Foundation, which we cultivated through just looking through what are their priority areas. And they have a very professional system of you submit a letter of inquiry, you have to find out about what the interests are, you then contact the program officer. They had an interest in Latin America we were aware of. We knew of their interest also in past funding around mining issues and governance in Peru. We suggested to them that the same kind of program should be looked at in Colombia, and through that process, and it took 7 to 8 months of sort of building that relationship, providing them evidence of what we do and how well we have worked in Latin America, we were able to get a decent grant from Ford Foundation for 2 years. Now, if you look at it's very important for us to have a big picture of what is the landscape of the kinds of foundations out there. So what I did here is just to give you a scale of the 20 or 25 actually largest foundations in the world. And surprisingly, often people think that Gates is the largest. The largest foundation now is the Inca Foundation, but it's not the largest in terms of giving. They are just keeping their reserves at present, but high potential for us also, but for anyone really, because right now they're just trying to figure out what to do. Does anyone know who started that foundation? It's very interesting because the origin of the wealth is not in the Netherlands, but it was set up in the Netherlands for tax purposes and other reasons. This was started by the family who own IKEA, the Swedish family who own IKEA, the furniture company, of course. The Swedes have a tradition of philanthropy also, going back to Alfred Nobel and so on. But they have set it up, and it's right now just kind of percolating. They have very little in terms of giving. But they want for the right time and to figure out the strategy when they have the right asset base to do this transformative giving. So they have a huge endowment, $36 billion. It's more than the Gates endowment. But the Gates endowment is much more giving. He's giving every year much more of his wealth. So one to keep an eye on. The Wellcome Trust in the UK is a huge philanthropy too, but they are very focused on health issues, of course. So probably not of much interest to us, neither of these. Howard Hughes is, of course, given by the famous aviator, again, not in our area. But a lot of the others are. Ford Foundation certainly is. Getty Trust is almost entirely for art, because they support 2 large museums in Los Angeles. This one has tremendous potential. It's a huge foundation set up by the Emir of Dubai. He hasn't also figured out how he's going to give away his wealth. And it's a lot of it, because the wealth was originally, it had its origins in minerals, though Dubai itself, of course, is now much more a service economy. There is a lot of potential here. Again, we haven't looked into it that much. The Li Ka-shing Foundation in Hong Kong, they have given tremendous amount of money for universities, several universities all over the world. Hong Kong, because of its ties to Australia, tremendous potential. And they give money also smaller projects, they give larger project funding as well, and a fairly large endowment as well. So, it's interesting. A lot of these would potentially have the Hewlett Foundation. We are in touch with now because of their interest in forest conservation. That's been one of the the areas of interest for them. Among the other ones, probably again MacArthur, I have noted before. Kellogg also has some interest in terms of education issues if we were to approach them. Pew Charitable Trust, Pew, Pew, does anyone know the origins of the Pew Charitable Trust? Sun Oil. So if you actually go to, I'm sure Alf has been to Fort McMurray, there's the center there, the information center. that was funded by the Pew Charitable Trusts, because the Pew, their family made their fortune in, originally they were the ones who discovered the tar sands mechanism, for getting oil and so on, the sun oil, before it became largely commercializable. So, I mean, now they're into climate change and other kinds of research areas, but Pew has its origins in mineral wealth to a large degree. More Foundation is Intel money. Both of them, husband and wife, extremely interested in forest conservation in Amazon. They've given almost half of their wealth for Amazon conservation. Then, of course, others. This is a very interesting one, the MasterCard Foundation. It's a huge foundation which it was set up in a very unusual way. It was essentially set, MasterCard are the cards we use. Originally, when MasterCard was established, it was a cooperative of banks. So it wasn't some one philanthropist who set it up. MasterCard, finally in 2006, they decided to go and have an IPO and go public. The shareholders, the 25,000 banks that were cooperatives of the owners of the MasterCard, when it went for the IPO, they said, this is a great time for us to show our philanthropic commitment. So they donated almost $5 billion worth of their new shares to establish a private philanthropy. Even though it is an American company, they established it in Canada to again show their international commitment. And it didn't really even have any particular tax reason for doing so, but it's based in Toronto. They give a lot of money for development-related work, very similar to the kind of work IM4DC has been doing. And they have a very open process of trying to get interactions. They have given a lot of money to universities. They give a lot of money for scholarships. They have particular partnership universities for scholarships. So, MasterCard is a fascinating case in terms of philanthropy, corporate philanthropy, because it wasn't an individual decision. It was the decision of these 25,000 banks who collectively established this foundation then. Okay. Now, types of grant-seeking opportunities, and I'll wrap up very quickly. First, you can be invited to submit a proposal. This is where I was saying, you have to sort of court the relationship many times with these individuals and firms and so on. If you are able to do that, then that, can really lead to very transformative kind of fundraising potentially, because you can get some people interested in projects which they may not have even thought of. But again, they would like to find you many times as well. So part of it is suggesting to other people who may know them that, these people are interesting and good. With Ford, that was sort of what we did, because we knew at Clark University there was a professor who had been funded by Ford for several times, Anthony Bebbington. We invited Anthony Bebbington here, as you may have met him when he came here for 2 weeks to spend some time here and so on. He then suggested to them, these people are okay. These guys in Australia was sort of an outpost, but they know their stuff. So, think about them. Then we approached them. Then they knew who we were. That helped to cultivate the relationship. And then that led to us eventually getting the grant. There are also regular requests for proposals and a competitive process for that. You have the annual Skoll Foundation Social Entrepreneurship solicitation. Skoll, one of the founders of eBay, has a special interest in social entrepreneurship. So he actually does a regular round of proposals. Anyone can submit ideas for great sort of opportunities in social entrepreneurship. So keep a lookout for those. The only way often to do that is just keep a lookout for scouring those emails and so on, where people may say, okay, think about this opportunity. There are chronicles of philanthropy and so on, which you could get onto your listservs. But just having a good radar for opportunities, every year they have a round, and anyone can submit ideas for that. There are others who, like MacArthur, who have a regular letter of inquiry format, where you can go in and submit just a 2-page letter of inquiry. The chances of getting a proposal through that are very small. These other two options are much more likely, because the number of letters of inquiry, I've spoken to one of the grant officers at MacArthur, and he said on average they get every month about 5,000 letters of inquiry. Because, you know, you can imagine every small little community group and so on, they're sending letters of inquiry. Country the size of the US, 300 million people. So weeding through that and finding, it's very difficult, but they still want to keep that process open. Some of them do that, but again, this chance is much slimmer. Occasionally you can get it. I have a friend who recently got a grant from MacArthur through this process. But he said, you know, the odds were really stacked against him, but then there was some other kind of lobbying which behind the scenes may have helped too. But it was on Chinese investment in Latin America, because MacArthur has an interest in those issues as well, and that's one of the areas, certainly within the mining sector also, that China is investing. So keys to success, this is the last slide. You know, build on historical involvement with the foundation. You have to find out more. You have to do your homework. What have there been their legacy projects, the history of the kinds of work they have been involved in. Ford is very proud of the work they did in certification systems. They started the Forest Stewardship Council. They've invested a lot in those kinds of due diligence, deliberative process of natural resource governance. That was something we built on in terms of how we approached them in our proposal as well. Connecting with their mandate, make sure you go through most of the time, their annual reports, everything is online. Make sure you quote actually their particular mandates. What have their boards actually given them accountability on? So then they will respond much better than just having something in a vacuum. Link your expression of interest or letter of inquiry to their plans of investment. They usually also have a plan, like a 5-year plan. Usually when a new foundation president comes in, they have a new vision plan, what the board sets out. So like Ford just got a new president last month. They will have their own new vision plan. MacArthur just 2 years ago, they hired Robert Gallucci as their president, who was a North Korea expert. And he was very interested in nuclear issues and nuclear strategy. And you can see within a year now, MacArthur's got a whole program of work around security issues as well. So the president, even though the president is not a decision maker on the grant, but the president can have a major influence on the kind of influence that the board is going to undertake moving forward, right? So keep a lookout for those kinds of, you know, and usually foundation presidents are very prominent people, often retired university presidents or chancellors. It's a great retirement job, you know, just to have landing, because now you don't have to worry about fundraising, you're actually more worried about giving money. So you have people like the former president of the University of Pennsylvania, Judith Rodin, who's now the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. You know, you can see from them in their bios what is likely to be their vision moving forward, and that's how you cultivate those kinds of ideas then. Highlight your competitive advantage. It's, you know, we're in Australia, we have to be very particular about saying why us, because there is so much out there and we have some disadvantages given our location. We're very far from a lot of places. People often don't know about us. People don't know about the university here. It's really important for foundations and private philanthropy that you must not come across as a service provider. And this is going to be very different from the industry proposals, which I'm sure Alf will talk about, because the philanthropists are very particular about, is this organization's really, their heart is in the place or not? Because they only give to nonprofits, remember. This source, and we are a nonprofit. But they really want to make sure that they're giving money which has sort of intrinsic worth to the entity that it's being given to. Right? And that's where a lot of this kind of strategic visioning and all is important. Often we think about why do we have all these strategic plans and visions and so on. But when you're actually applying for these kinds of funds, they ask for those. They want to know what is that organization's overall vision of doing good in the world, and your ethical obligations, your commitment to civic engagement, to public citizenship. They want all that. So you really have to come across in those terms, that you are out there with that broader, much more profound vision. You need to target key staff and partners, what I was saying. Make sure there are some local partners. You need these gate openers who will know the way, the modus operandi of that philanthropy. And that will really help you to then move forward with your agenda. So those are just some highlights, and I'll end there.